Well, welcome back. Thank you for dragging yourselves in from the sunshine. We have now a very special treat. Alice Grahame, who has written about Walter Segal, not just written about, but lives in one of his houses, so can give us the truly visceral experience. Once we've listened to Alice and had some questions, we're going to get the three speakers back up to the top here and just have that final discussion. But anyway, over to Alice. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this. I'm, pretty chuffed to have been invited. So that's great because one of my favourite topics is Walter Segal. So you might have seen in my bio that I'm not an architect or of any type, landscape or otherwise, designer, not an academic. I actually would consider myself to be an enthusiast. So I became interested in the topic of architecture and in particularly Walter Segal when I moved into a Segal house, and that was 16 years ago. Even just first looking around the house, I could see that it was like a bit different to other London houses. It was, firstly, it was cheaper than other houses in the area. Sort of, for the equivalent of a 3-bedroom house, and it didn't look or feel like a typical London house. It just seemed a bit unusual, and I remember that the estate agent made no effort whatsoever to try and sell the house. She clearly knew nothing about it. She just said, well, it's a bit different, isn't it? And just sort of let myself and all the other people just kind of get on with it. So I was just curious to find out more about this person who designed this very unusual estate. There didn't seem to be much information at all. There was like a little paragraph in Wikipedia, a couple of paragraphs. There was a book on Walter Segal, which was from 1989, which was long since out of print. I managed to get an old second-hand copy, which was, really expensive, a kind of, one of these really sort of difficult to get books. So I started talking to the other people, the neighbours, and people who'd worked with Segal, people who'd met him, and I found out that there was like a really, really interesting story. So since within those sort of 16 years of being involved, learning about Segal, I've written some articles, books. A bit of a highlight was an exhibition that myself and some others put on at the Architectural Association. There's gradually been a bit of a raise in interest in Segal, I believe, over the years. I've never actually thought about Segal from a landscaping point of view. In fact, I'm not aware that there was a landscape architect on the project. Some of you please correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that Segal did the designs pretty much on his own. He worked with another architect, John Broome, who's recently retired. And the two of them produced the road and the houses, and I've never heard of it sort of spoken about in a landscaping context. So I think it might be that the landscape just kind of developed organically without there being kind of a designer or architect who planned it. So I'm just going to go on to this next slide. So I just wanted to check if people in the room know about Walter Segal or have heard of him. Has anyone heard of him at all? Okay, so there is some awareness, but I just thought I'd do a little potted biography of who he was for those who don't know. So this is a picture of Walter Segal. He was always with a cigar. He was quite short stature and had this sort of shock of white hair. And this is, you can see quite clearly that he's on a building site. So he was born in 1907 in Berlin. His father was quite a well-known abstract expressionist painter called Arthur Segal, whose paintings are still sort of quite collectible. So Arthur Segal moved the family, including Walter, to Ascona in Switzerland during the First World War, and that's where Walter Segal grew up. It was a very kind of artistic place. There was an artistic community down the road on an area called Monte Verita, and lots of sort of bohemian arty type people would be coming into the Segal's house, and it was a very kind of, sounded like a very kind of vibrant and creative community. Then in 1929, Walter went back to Berlin to study architecture. He was taught in a kind of the modernist style, so he learned from I think Polzig and to be honest, I'll have to come back to this because I haven't quite got it at the tip of my fingertips, but he learned the sort of the modernist style that was being taught at the time. Taut, sorry, that was the name I was trying to get to, was Bruno Taut was one of his teachers, I believe. Then after his training, he got some work in Mallorca, where he designed some houses in the sort of kind of generic kind of Balearic style. And then there was an opportunity for him to go to Cairo actually as a tomb surveyor rather than an architect. So he was working on Tutankhamun's tomb, surveying it, so drawing it. One of his skills was kind of doing these amazing drawings, and because of that he got an opportunity then to go to London to work at the British Museum, again cataloguing Egyptian relics. He wrote a book about ancient Egyptian chairs and thrones, so that was one of his subjects. So he stayed in London pretty much for the rest of his life. He taught architecture at the Architectural Association. He also wrote, I think in Architect's Journal, he had a regular column. He was called Astragal, that was his pen name. And he also designed some houses and apartment blocks in London. The project he's probably most famous for, and the kind of the entry level kind of knowledge of Walter Segal, would be the Lewisham self-build project. And that was a project that he did with Lewisham Council. It was social housing, and he worked with the local council, did the designs, and the designs were then built by ordinary local people who were on the housing waiting list, who got a chance to build their own homes. And that was in the 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, Segal died in 1985 before his second project was finished, so he actually never saw Walter's Way complete. This is actually Segal's first ever commissioned building, which was a beach hut, lakeside hut cabin on the shores of Lake Maggiore. That was where, in Ascona, that's where his family had lived when he was a child, and he got this job because the owner of that piece of land was called Bernard Meyer, was wanted the cabin, and he was the patron of Arthur Segal. So the families kind of knew each other, and so through this contact, he got to develop build this project, which was in the 1920s. You can see a kind of a typical Segal style, which you'll see in his later work, which the flat roof, the timber, the decking are all things that are in the Segal self-built houses, which were built much later. His main book, where he set out his design principles, was called Home and Environment. So I was just saying that there's a copy here, which is really interesting because it's been out of, as far as I know, it's been out of print for decades. And it's quite a hard to get book. So you can see what he was suggesting. It was actually the aim of the project was looking at density. After the war, the government wanted to increase housing. There was a desperate need for housing, and they were really interested in density in terms of how much housing you could put on a size of piece of land. And so that's one of the things he was investigating in this book. As you can see, each house has, the houses are separate, so they're separate but connected. Each one has a little bit of private space, including a raised upstairs private balcony, but also, very importantly, is the communal space at the bottom where people are enjoying themselves. They're out with their children, their dogs, they're doing some gardening. And I think this was Walter Segal's vision. He unfortunately never got to build this estate. I think the closest he came is probably Walter's Way, which is my estate. So this is just a sort of a reference point that this never actually got built. But it's quite interesting to see. I think a lot of the things here, people would say are really good design principles. This is what I call his earlier work. So this is before the self-build era. The one on the left is St Anne's Close, which he built as a community for architects. So he built one of the houses for himself. The biggest one actually is the one that he and his family lived in. And it's a horse. It's a bit hard to photograph from that position, but it's a horseshoe shaped estate. I believe it was social housing. And there still seem to be quite a lot of architects who live there today. So I think it's still got that tradition. The other one, the next one is Tasker Road, which is sort of Belsize Park, West Hampstead area, and that's a terrace of houses. So you can just sort of see that the style is sort of a bit modernist, a bit kind of English, kind of traditional. It's hard, you know, you wouldn't say that that is kind of hardcore modernist. It's sort of not really anything. Well, you may have a better way of describing it, but that's what he did. That he was commissioned to do those. They were earlier works. Then this was his house that he built for himself, the one on the left there. After Walter's first wife died, he married his second wife, who had 5 children, and she also had a big 3-story Edwardian house in Highgate, which he decided to demolish to build this modern house here for himself and his family. Whilst that was going on, whilst the building work was taking place, his family lived in this cabin, which he got his carpenter to build for, I think it was like £600 or something. It just took a few weeks to put up. And as you can see, it's a cabin with some panels and a flat roof and on stilts. It wasn't designed to last for a long time, but it did actually stay standing for at least 50 years, at which point it mysteriously got burnt down in a house fire whilst the house was on the market. So that was known as the Little House in the Garden. And when Segal always worked at home, so when clients came to visit him to discuss work, they would see this little house in the garden, and they decided that that's what they wanted. It was popular. And so Segal was commissioned to build some of these privately. I think there was some in Ireland, there's one a couple in Oxfordshire. Many have actually now been taken down because then they weren't particularly, it was not particularly robust. As you can see, the timber is quite thin. So that's the Little House in the Garden. The story is that one of his clients who was having one of these built fell out with their builder. They had a big argument, the builders left, and the client decided to continue the building himself. And that's where the notion of self-build was born. I mean, of course, people have been building their own houses, you know, since people ever started sheltering themselves. But in terms of the Segal self-build project, and this is sort of the first hint of self-build was building these. Let's see the next thing. So this is the Walter Segal. So he developed his blueprint for self-builders. I know self-building in this country is not really much of a thing. People watch Grand Designs, but Grand Designs generally have a team of builders. This was a very different type of self-build, where people were actually physically making the houses themselves. And this is the Lewisham scheme that we can see here. This type of self-build has become known as the Segal method, which again, it's a traditional method. He saw balloon housing, which was the American type of house building. He wouldn't claim to have invented this, but this is what he did with the local people in Lewisham. So it starts as a flat project with each family working on their own house on the ground, and then they're making the frame. And then when the frame is made, all of the families come together, the local community comes together, and they pull up the frames into a standing position. And then the house is goes from being a flat 2D thing to a 3D structure. And then the roof and floor and the cladding are put on. And this is what's become known as the Segal method of self-build. So the Lewisham project, I must check that I haven't missed anything because I've got it all written down. The Lewisham project, it was all council housing, social housing. In the 1970s, there was a housing crisis, and the council were willing to consider something a bit different. It was like way before there was right to buy or any of those complications. So on the council, there were some people like Nicholas Taylor, who was an elected councillor. Brian Richardson was the deputy borough architect. Ron Pepper was the leader of the council, and John Broome, who had worked with Segal, was a young architect working at the council. They met Colin Ward, who was a anarchist writer who wrote quite a lot about squatters and housing, very grassroots housing. That they met. It took 5 years of negotiations to get it all funded and agreed. The self-builders were chosen by ballot. The self-build project was advertised, people could apply, put their name on the list, they got chosen, names were picked out at the town hall, and they worked, the self-builders, once they were in place, they did lots of training, they went on training courses, some with Walter Segal, they worked weekends and evenings, and it took them, most families, about 18 months to build their house. So this is the first one, the first phase, from 1978 to 80. As you can see, they've got the they've got some similarities with Segal's first commission, the house in Ascona and the little house in the garden. They've got the flat roof, they've got the panels, quite simple structure. The first two images are Segal Close, and the one that's on its own is called Longton Avenue. So Segal Close is like a little estate of 7 houses. Longton Avenue, I think 2 or 3 houses. And I mean, I would suggest that these houses work much better if they're in a group. I think it can look a bit odd if it's just sort of between, you can see what it's like between the typical Victorian or Edwardian houses. It just looks a bit squat. But when you've got like a whole road of them, it actually it sort of reaches a critical mass, I think, and then you get the full effect. Then the next one is Walter's Way, which was the second phase. So these ones, you can see they're 2-storey, so more ambitious for all of the self-builders, but similar material, so the panels, the wood, the flat roofs, and the similar construction method. There was a bit of a gap between the first and second phase of that. This was around the time that this was in progress. That's when Walter Segal died. So it was John Broome who took over at that point and was the main architect on the project. In terms of the landscaping, as I mentioned before, I've never been told about any landscape architecture that was involved. But do let me know if anyone knows anything otherwise. So just to say that these houses are all now privately owned, both the first phase and the second phase. So with right to buy and leasehold reform, these are no longer in social ownership, although there are some later Segal schemes from after Segal had died. There was a housing visionary called Jose Ospina, who worked with some of the architects who'd worked with Segal, and they produced some housing estates, small housing estates, using the Segal method and using self-build, and those also are in Lewisham, and they're a housing association, so they're still in social ownership. I thought I'd do a bit about why does Segal, focusing particularly on Walter's Way, why does it sort of have that kind of landscape or the feel that it does? So when people walk along, the road is called Honour Oak. The road is called Honour Oak Park. The area is also called Honour Oak Park. It's just on the edge of Lewisham and Southwark. It's that road is the border between Lewisham and Southwark. It's a very leafy area. Across the road there's One Tree Hill, which is Southwark-owned scrub sort of park where you can walk up and admire the view. This is also just 5 minutes walk from the railway station, which is just down the hill. It's very hilly because the area is Forest Hill, is just hilly. You know, anyone who cycles will sort of tell you that the gradient is quite steep, and Walter's Way itself is on a slope. The reason why the self-build project was put in this place was that the ground was considered unsuitable for conventional housing. So it was a tiny pocket of land considered not suitable for conventional housing because it was too hilly, too prone to subsidence, too small. Yeah, I think it had been rejected for other projects. There was apparently a school in that spot before. It's sort of almost feels like a secret road, so like taxi drivers tend not to have heard of it. People can just walk or drive past without knowing it's there. So, you know, which is that sort of, I think, adds to the charm. You can see the ground. This is Segal Close. I know that because Walter Segal is alive and involved at that point. That's Segal Close, and this other one is Walter's Way. You can sort of see that it's small, with, you know, kind of fenced around, and that the self-builders are just kind of digging by hand into the clay, which from what I've heard, I've met, out of the 13 houses in Walter's Way, 3 of them are self-built families. They've said it was like horrendous. It was sort of like 1984, 85, sort of freezing winter, and they were just like digging into the ground, and it was not really fun at that point, although they did later on appreciate that they'd, you know, built their own houses and it was amazing. But this is the slope. This is what we're drawn by Walter Segal of a plan for Segal Close. At that point it was called Brockley Park. And you can just sort of see the way that the houses are just kind of in with the trees. To me, I think it looks a bit more like a kind of some kind of like woodland glamping site or sort of holiday cabins. In fact, when people walk into Walter's Way or Segal Close, one of the things they always say is like, this reminds me of being on holiday, or this reminds me of back home in Jamaica, or it reminds me of back home in Scandinavia, or it reminds me of back home in Canada or New Zealand or wherever. It just has this kind of feeling of not being quite like normal London houses. Walter's Way is also on a slope. As you can see in the first picture, people, you know, have to sort of go up and down steps to their houses. I think accessibility wasn't really considered at the time. More recently, families who've needed wheelchair access have made a ramp themselves. And in this other picture, you can see that the children have kind of make the most of the landscape that they have. There's cars there, it's not pedestrianised, and the ground is very unforgiving for those scraped knees. And I think probably almost every child has had some sort of you know, unpleasant experience with falling on that ground. It wasn't particularly designed with children in mind. There's no kind of play area or anything. The children use the street and make it their own. So with the Segal design, there's no conventional foundations on these houses, and that goes back to the cabin in Ascona and the little house in the garden, the same style. In this one, so for the up until the little house in the garden, there were no piles. It was just simply resting on the lawn, on paving slabs on the lawn. By this stage, which is I think this one is Segal Close and that's Walter's Way. They've got dug, before the self-builders arrived, a professional team came and dug holes and put in piles, and you can see the little pieces of metal sticking out the top. And then a patio was put on the ground, and the house is built on the patio. So a bit different to, you know, foundations that we generally see at the start of a building project. The result is that the houses are on stilts. So you can see at the bottom of that house, that half-finished house, the frame, the bottom portion of the frame is the stilts. The stilts are not glued to the ground or stuck to the ground in any way. So that means that the house is quite movable. It's a movable house, a flexible house. The houses shift. So you find out that if you need to like replace a door, like a bathroom door or anything, or a front door, it's all kind of wonky. The houses move. But having said that, they seem to have some kind of resilience. So when there was a massive storm, which I think was in 1987, when they were still building Walter's Way, I think all of the self-builders rushed to the site, you know, the next day to see what had happened, expecting their houses to be demolished. But in fact, the houses were standing, but a brick wall at the beginning of the road had collapsed. So, you know, that people thought that was obviously amazing. And then I think the other thing about these houses is that they're quite easy to repair if if something untoward happens. So for example, I think at one point someone's car brakes malfunctioned, the car crashed into someone's kitchen. The self-builders sort of got some jacks and things, kind of jacked the house back up again and repaired it. More recently, there was a storm a few years ago, and a tree collapsed, taking someone's deck off the house. And again, a builder came and just sort of jacked up the house again and kind of put it back into shape. And it's different. They're lightweight. Just a different style of house altogether, really, compared to what most UK houses are like. One of the advantages of being on stilts, you can see in these images, is that the houses are very close to the trees, and for me, I think that's the most amazing feature of these Segal developments. That one's Segal Close, and this one's Walter's Way. You can see, like, one of the trees there is a Wellingtonia. You can only just see the edge of it there. There's, big London plane trees. We all occasionally have our trees pollarded, but and there were some trees taken down in the build, but generally, because of the houses being on stilts, we're a lot closer to trees. We have like branches poking through bedroom windows and things. Another advantage of being on stilts is because of the trees, we have like lots of wildlife. So, I mean, the parakeets, I don't know, do you have parakeets here in Reading a lot, or in London? In South London, we have a lot of parakeets, but we also have like owls and other birds, the foxes and things. I mean, like stag beetles as well seem to be quite like the area. People say it's a bit like living in a forest or some kind of tree house when they visit. Just checking that I haven't missed anything interesting. Oh yes, also because of being on stilts, and I believe you'll know more than me if you've been involved in house building, there's no damp, there's no subsidence, no dry rot or anything like that, no connection with the ground, being raised up off the ground. Also for insulation, where people have upgraded their homes by insulating. If they want to insulate the floor, they go under the floor and insulate under the floor, that kind of thing. So there are advantages to being on stilts. So the reason that a Segal house looks the way it looks is because of Segal's design, and one of the features of that is the materials. They're all made from the same materials. So one of these is, of course, timber. So there's the timber frame. Not only is there timber frame, but there's also timber battens throughout the exterior, which give the houses that typical stripy look. Now the stripes they're not just on the outside, the stripes on the inside as well, and that can be a bit difficult to live with when you're trying to sort of hang pictures that are not kind of long and thin. You have to kind of adapt to that, and I think maybe some people would find it a bit difficult to live with. So the battens are 60 centimetres apart. The wall of the Segal house is a sandwich of inside there's plasterboard, then in the middle the insulation is wood wool slabs, and then the exterior is gazelle board, which is these shiny panels which were quite common at the time, I think used in industrial buildings sort of in the 70s. The houses were bolted together, so there's no glue, all held together by bolts. Again, that adds to the flexibility, movability of the house. The roof, again, going back to Segal's first design, as you can see, it's a flat roof, single sheet of, I think what's used is Pirelli rubber, a sheet of rubber, and then there's either water or rubble on the top to hold it down. And then what happens is basically it becomes a green roof by accident because birds drop the seeds on the roofs, and so you don't have to plant up a sedum roof or anything. You just get a green roof organically. So I think that pretty much covers the materials. Oh yes, so yeah, the overhanging roof, which is important for weatherproofing, that's from when he was in Switzerland. I believe that's a Swiss feature, and provides both shade and protection from the elements, where some of the self-builders built right out and they didn't keep the overhang, and you can actually tell a big difference between the deterioration of those houses where they haven't had that overhang. So it seems like it does make a difference. Oh, again, the other thing about the roof is it's not glued down. It's just the parts, it's just weighted down with what's on the roof. And the materials were chosen for economy because it was a social housing project and everything had to go through Lewisham Council. They were very restricted on what materials they could use. So they chose materials that were cheap and that were easily available in regular shops. I have to say I've never seen Blazel boards in a shop, but I believe at the time in builders merchants, they were more common than they are now. The other thing is it was designed for ease of build. So to minimize cutting, the materials were used in their bought sizes. So the panels were that width and were used and were kept that width so that they didn't have to all be cut. So yeah, that's why they look like that. Some people think that there's like a Walter Segal style, but it's really just kind of because of what was used to make them. So this is Walter Segal. This is actually Walter's Way, and you can see the original drawing shows the 12 houses all facing the same way. But the actual road, the finished road, actually looks like this, the picture on the right. So I don't know how, what conversation was had or whether it was decided on the ground to go from the square aspect to the higgledy-piggledy aspect, but certainly the way that they have come out, it's much more interesting. Every house has some south-facing windows, quite often with the two windows, sort of windows on two different planes, so you get extra sunlight. So this drawing actually is by Brian Richardson, who was the deputy borough architect, which I just think it's a really nice drawing actually. And so the fact that they're all tilted makes, although the houses are all the same, they're all designed by Segal and all in the same style, you kind of feel that each one is kind of special. Oh, that's it. So this is just a kind of a theory, is that Walter Segal spent time in Mallorca in the early 1930s, and this is a drawing that he did of Daya, houses in Daya, and you can see they're all sort of on a sloping down, and that's why I think, in a way, just going back to this Walter's Way one, I don't know, I can't say for certain that it was an inspiration, but certainly Walter's Way has a slight kind of Mediterranean, odd kind of feel to it, a slightly kind of, so there might be a connection between the two. He's not there for us to ask, so we'll never really know, but we can speculate. So I just thought I'd go through some distinctive elements of the Walter Segal design that I think it impacts on the landscape. One of them is the use of wood. So people do say, we did for one of the, so myself and a photographer, we made this book, and we basically interviewed everyone in Walter's Way and Segal Close. One of the things people say is like the street, and on my house, they start saying something like, my house is relaxing, it's like going for a walk in the woods. And I think the use of wood does help with that. You can see here, the house has got double deck, so people can sit out at different levels. That in turn makes an indoor-outdoor space, so people can be kind of outdoors in having some fresh air, but at the same time they're sheltered from the element. And this also happens, sort of carries over onto the interior. So that's I'm not showing much of the inside because I know you're interested in the landscaping, but this is the Segal stairs, which he kind of designed to fit into a very small space with using minimum wood. And those stair treads are actually the most expensive, probably the most expensive material used in the house, because they're a tropical hardwood. The rest of it is all softwood. It's pine basically, or whatever, with maybe some Douglas fir for the more structural timber. So use of wood. And then I think another thing that impacts on the landscape is the adaptability of the houses. So Segal believed that a house should adapt to its occupants, not the other way around, so that you should be able to change your house when you need to as your family changes. So we've got stories of people, families, so a couple might move in, they have no kids, and then they want more spaces for socializing, so they can take out an internal wall because the walls are not structural. And then when the families are all older, the kids are older, they can then put walls back. So if people want more private spaces, so people can change their houses. I think of the 13 houses in Walter's Way, only three of them have got the original self-built people, the people who built them. The rest all sold their houses and moved. But somehow the spirit of somehow the agency that people got from building their own house seems to have stayed in the street, and people seem to be a bit inspired to be creative. So this house, this got on the left here, the person who built that glass extension, apparently he worked at Heathrow, and there was the British Airways headquarters, I think, was having some glass delivered, and it was the wrong size or something. So he got that glass and added it to his house. The one in the middle, they built a tree house for their kids. And they built it themselves. You can see the owner basically attached the tree house to the tree, and he actually did. I was there where he lifted up, made a kind of a pulley to pull up the windows. There's a big window at the back, and people were sort of kind of helping by all kind of tugging at the string to get the windows raised up off the ground. The house on the right here is clad in Akoya, which is it's a softwood which is treated with acetic acid to give it the properties of a hardwood, so it's very weatherproof. I've got a few more things. I think how are we doing for time?
5 minutes.
Okay, so I've got a few things here. Just that some of this is. I didn't prepare that many slides because obviously I thought my talk was going to be short. But so we've got there's one person here, and he collects stained glass. So he's done this in his house, and that is actually the exterior of the house at the time of being photographed. So you can see he's sort of gone quite crazy there. And this also, I don't know if you can see this here, but this is a yoga studio. So one of the people who is a yoga teacher, he had this added, he bought the yoga studio, he bought it from Germany. I remember it arriving on a truck, all the glass came from Germany, and he sort of attached it to the side of his house. And yeah, there's some more examples of creative house adaptations if you're interested in the book. So yeah, I think people somehow feel that they can have a go. Even people might build a car shelter, or one resident who has an allotment built an allotment shelter in the Walter Segal style. So I think people are, sort of want to have a go. It's kind of an appealing project. The other thing is with doing a sort of a more eco refurb as well. The houses are adaptable. You can take off the exterior walls, put in different types of insulation. So wood waste, for example, which is a compostable insulation, that kind of thing. It just makes it a bit easier. You can insulate from underneath, you can insulate the roof around the sides. You can put solar panels. We've got that house there. You can't see them, but that one's got solar panels. Some of the houses have got solar panels. Some have got underfloor heating. One tried a ground source heat pump. So it's just kind of an invitation. Oh, the houses are not listed, and that's another thing in that they actually are on a Lewisham list, but they're not on a Historic England list. So people can do what they want, and none of the residents have ever wanted their houses to be listed because they want the freedom to change the house exterior if they want to. I mean, obviously that we'd still have to apply for planning permission, you know, for an extension, but the 20th Century Society have visited, but they know it's sort of like a hodgepodge, really. I don't know that it's, that I think they've never sort of tried to list it, as far as I know, which means that people can do what they like within limits. So this is pretty much my final slide. So I just thought I'd just mention the street itself. So the actual road was built by professionals. It wasn't built by the self-builders. So a team came in and landscaped and tarmacked the road. So maybe there was a landscape designer involved at that point. It's a private road. I'm not quite sure why it's a private road, but it is a private road, which means that the residents have joint responsibility for the road surface, the lighting, and sweeping the street. So we've got a residents association. So every now and again, the chair of the residents will be like, this Sunday we're all sweeping the street, and then he'll go and sweep the street, and then others will also join in and help with, because we have lots of trees, so there's lots of leaves to sweep up. There's one or two social events in the calendar. So there's always a summer party and Christmas gathering. We also do London Open House every year in September, and that's quite a big event for Walter's Way. So yes, everyone pays a charge into the Residents Association. The one thing is that the street is not pedestrianised, and the one thing that does cause arguments is the parking. So some of the houses at the bottom, they don't have road access because they're kind of like down the little passage, so they have to park in the street, and it can cause no end of problems. But I've learned from previous talks that sometimes, like, the cars and the parking can be an area where, you know, the community struggles to stay cohesive. And as I think I mentioned before, the children play in the area. They use the street. Each house has a private garden, but the children tend to play in the street. There are no play facilities, and there's cars, so they just sort of learn to use the street, make it their own. Adults also tend to gather for a drink. There's a picnic table where people can sit, and sometimes there's a fire pit, and so there's some sort of social space, which is actually down to one family, well, mine in fact, because we don't have a car, so we have our parking space is like the social space with the fire pit and the picnic. But then even that can sometimes cause raised eyebrows, because people are sort of like, but that could be parking, you know. But it's, you know, there's this kind of there is a bit of a an issue between, you know, how much space should be parking and how much the space should be used for something else. I think that's pretty much it from me. I have to say this. I've produced a couple of books about Walter Segal, should you be interested. One of them is this one, which is basically portraits. This is more of a coffee table book, and this is about Walter's Way and Segal Close, with interviews and photos by a fantastic photographer called Karen Wilkie. And the other one, Walter Segal, Self-Built Architect, I produced that with architectural historian called John McKean, who actually met Segal, worked with Segal back in the day. We've got an introduction with Kevin MacLeod. And for today, I spoke to the publisher, and they've set up a code for anyone who's interested to get 20% off with this code here. So if you think you might be interested in the book, do make a note of that code, which you type in that's for buying it off the publisher's website, and that's Lund Humphreys. So that's it. That's me done.
Well, thank you very much. If there are just maybe two questions, and then we'll go into the general ones. So first one.
I'm interested that they're called Walter's Way and Segal's place.
Yeah, Segal Close.
When the whole ethos is self-build, it's really intriguing. Do you know why?
Yeah, as I understand it,
It's a contradiction, isn't it? So
Yeah,
it's
as
about the individual, but actually they've ended up naming after.
Yeah, as I understand it, yeah, I think it was that. I think so. Apparently, the name was chosen by the self-builders because he died sort of right coming to the end of the project. So Segal Close before was called like Brockley Park or something, and Walter's Way was called like 121 117 to 121 on Oak Park or something like that. And the self-builders, together with the council, decided to name them after Walter's.
I find it really interesting to compare with like this morning's talk where we were talking about the place names being like Kentish, you know, in the British Crown. So they've deliberately gone out their way to name the places after a kind of vernacular, blah, blah, blah. This scheme presents the most kind of vernacular style of architecture. Yet the place naming is very hierarchical. In terms of
Yeah, but it was apparently it was chosen by the self-builders from what I heard. I mean, from what they've told me. I mean, the thing that I ask myself is where did the apostrophe go in Walter's Way? Because actually in pictures of it before, earlier pictures, there's an apostrophe and it's Walter apostrophe S Way, and then later on the apostrophe is gone. So I just don't know. I don't know what happened. No one seems to know.
If we could have our speakers at the front. It's really only if there are particular things that people want to ask.
Start with something that occurred to me when Jerry was talking about the fact that at Whitehall Wall there was fluid, there was no master plan. They wanted flexible like that, which caught my eye because Lyons had the same approach at New Ash Green, and he was infuriated with the planners because they wanted every single neighbourhood to be fully detailed, and he refused to do it. So he got planning permission. He had to fight for it really hard. And for the first civil development over Minnis, the 23 houses. And a lot of the objections came from the people in that area who lived there. They didn't want this great big village, terrible thing landing on them. And I guess they put pressure on their local representatives. And it was so close to the Greenbelt. So it was, you know, people don't like change. He really had to fight with the planners to say, no, I'm not detailing at all. Here's over Minnis, the rest will follow in that spirit. Because he wanted to flex. That's the thing about span housing. They made little adjustments as things went along, etc. Yeah, just make that comparison.
Just follow on from that, it's quite interesting to think about that in the spirit of the sort of current emerging agenda about coding and design coding and like how that, I don't know, how is it, what have we learned from these projects of the 60s, 70s, 80s and like.
I think you need a visionary, I think. So it strikes me that Erskine was, Segal was, Lyons was, and Lyons was all into letting a community evolve. He wanted this flexibility with the planners. He hated bureaucracy. I mean, he really got mad about it. However, he was a tyrant in terms of his, a bit like the naming, it was this contradiction built into the whole concept, because he was a tyrant about having those rules followed. That's why he set up those rules, the rules of the Residents Association, etc. And God help anybody who would break them, because he wasn't having it. He had this big vision, and he had to have that. But he didn't expect to have to follow the rules of the planners.
Can I just ask, it's based on the Segal talk, did people have to buy a plot of land? Because we've been talking about communal landscaping and private landscaping, or private gardens. Yeah. You mentioned they have private gardens, but you also said that there was, sometimes conflict about what land should be used for.
So they never bought their land. They never bought a piece of land.
Of course,
the council, housing, wasn't it? That's it. The council gave them the plot of land.
But they did have a prescribed plot.
Yes, they had a plot. Some people have extended. There was actually some land kind of on one edge, and some people have bought a bit of extra land to have a better garden. But each plot had some private garden, south facing. Yeah, that's and just the road. So there was the road and the house and the private garden. There's no communal garden. It's just the road itself.
Which was private, you said, but
It's a private road, and I'm not quite sure why it ended up as a private road. So the refuse people still come down there to do the bins. But for the road surfacing, the lighting, there used to be a sewage pump, and street sweeping, the residents had to look after all of that.
Interesting, it's St Anne's Close in Highgate, the one you mentioned. I know that one. I live not far from it, and I think it was a degree of. I think he started building that with fellow architects for their families, and that does have. Has anybody been there? Do you know it? It does have an element of landscape design, because you go down this wee lane to it. Feels quite rural and bucolic behind St Anne's Church, and then it opens up into this lovely big rectangular space with a couple of great big trees on it. And then the houses are there, and then they go up there a wee bit. There's only about half a dozen, isn't it? So somebody had to make decisions about using that space in terms of, so there was thinking about landscape design in terms of, you know, not building on that bit, keeping those great big trees, thinking about where the cars went, because they stay away from the houses. They're down on the laneway, aren't
That's
they?
it. So there's a huge space that looks like a village green in the middle.
Yeah, and
it's close. But then the other odd thing is interesting thing is that it's really hard to find St Anne's Close. I looked through it and you have to go down a little passage. Walter's Way is kind of quite hard to find just because it's so small. People single closes down a little passage. Tasker Road, the view from the road, it looks like the back of some garages or something. It really looks like some garages. There's no ground entrance. Even Segal's own house, which was the 9 North Hill one, the roadside looks like a goods entrance or something. It looks, you just sort of see a wall and you have to go through a passage to find the entrance of the house and the garden. So I think Segal definitely wasn't about grand facades.
I think there's a common thing actually with the span developments, which is they needed inexpensive plots of land to do these jobs, to build on them. And it's the same with a lot of the early span stuff. You know, they were little backlands. And so they are discrete entrances often. Sometimes they merge, so in Blackheath they become great big behemoths, you know, but generally they were small little places. So that's a common thread, isn't it, with this kind of...
The modest, I would say. I mean, that's one thing. Even 9 North Hill, which it was, you know, it's now an expensive house in Highgate, it's kind of quite modest in a way. Like you saw it, it's not... You know, it's sort of 2 stories, quite short, and I mean, I'm not sure the reasoning behind that, but all of the buildings seem to be quite modest, and I wonder if that's why Segal has never really caught on or really become popular, because the homes are quite sort of pared down, sort of very back to basics, really, but well designed. You know, people who know really love them, but
it's kind of similar to what Jerry was saying about the human scale of design. The appeal of these places or in their landscape designs, that the pedestrian scale, you know, the person with the pram or the older person, have got a richness to them at that scale. You don't need to have a grand entrance, which a lorry driver sees. You just need the entrance where you know if you live there.
It also comes from kind of almost like the medieval village pattern. And one of the images that Jerry showed, I turned out Hal and I agreed that it looked very Italian, you know, going up to the hill with the pergola cross and the detailing, the ramping the steps. So, I mean, they know how to do it in Italy, don't they? You know, in terms of dealing with the weather, the heat and stuff, and the shading, but it does give that intimacy and the place where you can have texture, whether it's your geraniums or your knickers hanging out, whatever it is. There's stuff of life, but also in terms of the modesty of it. I mean, Lyons was a businessman, and he looked at it from the perspective he could sell these houses and make money out of it. But he identified, I didn't explain at the beginning, because I think probably most of the audience understand that, you know, the name span came from that concept of spanning the gap between the one-off bespoke housing and the mass building, bogus type housing. And they targeted at middle-class professionals mostly. And he was probably quite mindful that he could push the budget up, but, you know, push the spend up a little bit, but not a lot. And with Segal, you know, he started off spending his own money, and I think he just become very mindful when, you know, any of us are doing, I bet you if we're doing any landscape jobs in our own gardens or lands, We don't spend the same type of money that we would spending a client's money.
So, yes, Alexander Segal never had a big budget for a project. He was always restrained by a budget and was very careful, with economy.
Yeah, well, that causes creativity, doesn't it? Gives rise to creativity.
John McKean say
yes.
about Walter Segal.
In what respect, as a person or?
Well, anything. I mean, did he? So he knew him. How did he know him again?
How did he know him? How did they first meet? I think it was at the Architectural Association. That's a good question.
Can wait till email. It's fine.
Absolutely. How did they first meet? So so one thing actually, he mentions it in the book that I mentioned. Walter Segal couldn't drive, and John McKean drove him around quite a bit, apparently. Was writing, but basically sort of spent quite a bit of time because he was writing this book called Learning from Segal, which was unfortunately Segal died during that process. In terms of where they first met, I think it was a connection with the Architectural Association, but I'll need to check actually.
I think we could probably wind up because we've had a fantastic day, huge amount of information. But otherwise, thank you very much for the speakers. Thank you for the organisation today and for the choice of speakers. And I'm sorry that Robert, definitely. And sorry that we were missing three. But as we said at the beginning, they are going to be press scanning, whatever, invited, much more gentle, into making their presentations, which will be eventually available to you all. But once again, thank you and thank you, Robert.